I just think that, again, we're at the very beginning of this movement. More and more parents are realizing what's possible for their kids' education. They're demanding change. They have increasing access to private education options beyond an assigned district school, thanks to the growth of school choice policies. And then I think because of the parent demand, now you have more and more of these education entrepreneurs, these parents and teachers stepping up to meet that demand by creating the learning environments that families really want.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Kerry McDonald. Kerry is a returning guest to the podcast, and she's the foremost documentarian of the rising microschool movement. She's the author of a book called Unschooled about the unschooling movement that you have probably heard me talk about on the show before. She's also the author of a forthcoming book called Joyful Learning that documents the microschool trend that is emerging across the country. In today's episode, Kerry and I talk about the trends in the microschool movement coming out of the pandemic and how across the country, both microschooling and homeschooling are on the rise. We talk about how school choice policy is affecting innovation in education and entrepreneurship in education. And we talk about some of the models and trends that Kerry is most excited about and that have been most interesting for her to see as she's been traveling across the country, visiting different schools, and as she's been interviewing school founders and entrepreneurs on her podcast multiple times a week, hearing the stories of people who are on the ground building interesting and innovative school models. As always, it was such a pleasure to get to talk to Kerry, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Kerry, welcome back to the podcast.
It's great to be back with you, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited you're back. I'm sad it took this long for us to get you back on the podcast because I have so many questions for you. I spend so much time on X talking about microschools and referring people to microschools, and I'm always just sending them back to your content because there's so much that you're documenting about the microschool movement. But before we get into microschool stuff, you have big news because you have a book that's coming out in a few months and is available for pre-sale now. And I want to talk all about it.
Thanks, Hannah. Yes, I have a new book coming out called Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. It's being published this summer by Hachette and their public affairs imprint. And it really details the stories of the everyday entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial parents and teachers across the U.S. who are creating these innovative education models, microschools, low-cost private schools, homeschooling collaboratives, virtual platforms, all kinds of incredible learning spaces, many of which you do such a great job of highlighting on X and in your podcast. So just great time to be in the education space, I think.
So I'm curious, I recommend your book Unschooled a lot. It's often on my short list of books that I tell parents, oh, you're interested in education, you want to get sort of a feel of the landscape and all the different options, this is one you should read. I'm curious how this book plays into Unschooled, if at all, and or if Unschooled is a jumping off point or if it's an entirely separate thing.
Yeah, it's an entirely separate thing, but it's just really interesting to sort of see the progression of interest in education, innovation, and entrepreneurship and alternatives to conventional schooling over the past couple of decades. So Unschooled came out in the spring of 2019, and that book really focused on the growth and diversification of the modern homeschooling movement. I did talk a bit about microschooling. I used the term microschool in that book, even though it was sort of the early days of microschooling. But it really focused mostly on homeschooling and self-directed learning centers. So sort of the philosophy of unschooling or self-directed education in which young people really take charge of their own education and adults are there to support them and connect them to resources, but really focus on that approach and sort of my family's experience with unschooling and self-directed education. So there was certainly for me, a lot of interest in alternatives to school, homeschooling, education, innovation, entrepreneurship then. And then, of course, COVID hit a year after the book came out. And so many more parents were interested not only in homeschooling, but sort of alternatives more broadly, and parent driven alternatives in particular. And so we saw sales of the book really skyrocket beginning in the spring of 2020. And what was also really interesting, and I feel like I was sort of well positioned to document, was this sort of emergence of more models of education. We saw the rise of pandemic pods in the summer of 2020 as parents really created these family centered small co-op models basically for making sure that their kids could continue to learn despite school closures and remote learning. And then many of those little pandemic pods in 2020 evolved into full-fledged microschools, or again, sort of intentionally small, highly individualized programs, but often more sophisticated, with hired educators and those, leased commercial spaces and so forth. And many of those continue to flourish today. So I really began documenting in earnest sort of the rise of education entrepreneurship that was actually growing in tandem with the rise of American entrepreneurship more generally, beginning in 2020. After years of a slump and stagnation in American entrepreneurship, we saw a boost due to the COVID response there. And the same thing was happening in education as well. And so I started my podcast in February of 2022. I was writing articles about these entrepreneurial parents and teachers who are creating these new learning models, and really seeing the kind of growth of this movement. And so Joyful Learning, my new book, really highlights what we've seen since 2020. So, certainly the roots of this movement were beginning well before school closures and remote learning and the pandemic, but they've really taken off over the past 5 years, and show no signs of slowing. I mean, I think that's what's so exciting. So the book really is geared towards parents looking to find an alternative education space for their children, something that's right for them, that's aligned with their needs and values. And it's focused on entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs who want to build something new and different. And there's so much overlap, right? Because often parents think that they want to find something for their kids. They can't find it. So then they go off and build it. And so the book really documents that process.
One of the things that I find so interesting and exciting about the microschool movement is that when people don't usually think about entrepreneurship and education in the same breath, if you think about entrepreneurship, you either think about big startups like going to Silicon Valley or Silicon Hills or there's Silicon Shores, there's like little Silicon spinoffs all over the country. But you're moving to a city, you're starting a startup, and you're building something very like tech focused and intended to scale, or you're thinking about local small businesses, but you're thinking about something like the local cafe or coffee shop or like a little marketplace for handmade clothes, or you're not thinking about launching a school when you're thinking about entrepreneurship. And when you think about education, most people think about you go and you get a education certification and you go work in an institution, you get a W-2 job, and that's how you work in education. And I don't think it's intuitive to people to think that you can be an educator but be very entrepreneurial about it. There's this real shift in the paradigm that's just starting to take hold. And you've been on the front lines of watching that shift take place. And I'm really curious what it is that you've seen in so many of the school founders that you've talked to that's allowed them to make this sort of cognitive shift in separating out education from institution as a career path and as a business model, and start to draw it into the realm of entrepreneurship where there really isn't a lot of cultural reference to think about it in those terms. So you have to get very creative in your thinking to even begin to imagine what that sort of path might look like. I'm really curious, as you've talked to so many founders and you've traveled all over the country, What is it that's shifting for people that's making them realize that this is a thing they can do and a viable path for them to take?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I'll say that the vast majority of the founders that I interview on my podcast or for my articles at Forbes and the 74 and at fee.org, the vast majority of them are former public school teachers who really grow disillusioned at what they see in the conventional classroom and decide that they can do things differently and want to try. And this was very much the trend that I was seeing in when I was writing Unschooled and in the founders that I talked to. They are again focused on one educational philosophy or self-directed education specifically. But I remember finishing that book and thinking, oh, it's so strange that 90% of the people who are running these self-directed learning centers across the country are former public school teachers. Interesting. And then, of course, now since 2020, and there's a variety of these microschools and low-cost private schools and related learning models. Again, that same trend. The vast majority are former public school teachers. And I think part of it is that they sort of see how the sausage gets made when they're in the system. And they realize very quickly that their creativity is just as stifled as their students' creativity, that their ability to kind of personalize learning and reach each child at an individual level is constrained in a conventional classroom. Many of them try valiantly to make changes within the system. And in fact, in my new book, I have an entire chapter devoted to intrapreneurs, those who really do try to make change within the system. There are some examples of success there, but for the most part, at least in the interviews that I've conducted, these founders just feel like they can't really break past those bureaucratic barriers, especially in recent years. The heightened focus on standardized testing and the inability to personalize learning so that they may have a class, for example, of 30 fourth graders, and they're all expected to be learning at the same level, at the same pace, all the same content. And teachers realize this is an impossible task because we're so different. There's so much variety in the human experience, especially in child development, that, you might have a 10-year-old who is, leaps and bounds ahead in English and reading skills, for example, but might not be quite at a 10-year-old level or typical 10-year-old level in terms of math or some other skill. And a conventional classroom just often doesn't allow for that flexibility and that differentiation of learning. And so I think what's really happened, Hannah, over the past 5 years is that is the growth of these network effects, so that you have a lot of teachers who have known that they are constrained within the existing system, but they don't really know what else to do. There were certainly always these pioneers who went ahead and tried to create something new, and I talk about them again in my previous book. But now what you see is that these teachers might, be feeling that discontent in the classroom, and they're now aware of all these other teachers just like them who have gone off and done something about it and created their own program, and that it's not that hard to do, that they can start very small, and they may be, astonished at how quickly they grow from, a dozen students to, 50 students in a wait list because there's so much demand from parents for this differentiated, individualized education. And the same is true for parents. I'm always interviewing parents who, again, they couldn't find what they were looking for. They weren't satisfied with the options for their kids. Tried to see, if something else was available. Maybe there are some sort of traditional private schools around, but in many cases, I hear from these parents, that the traditional private schools have a lot of the same sort of standardization and regurgitation flaws that, traditional public schools have, and that's not quite what they're looking for. They can't find it, so they go off and create their own and have a similar trajectory in many cases of quick growth and a lot of parent demand. I just, for example, recently had a founder on my podcast from Minnesota, a homeschooling mom who has grown her hybrid homeschool program, which meets several days a week with hired teachers, to over 100 students in just the past couple of years, and has now a wait list there as well. So, I just think that, again, we're at the very beginning of this movement. More and more parents are realizing what's possible for their kids' education. They're demanding change. They have increasing access to private education options beyond an assigned district school, thanks to the growth of school choice policies that I think we'll talk about a bit more. And then I think because of the parent demand, now you have more and more of these education entrepreneurs, these parents and teachers stepping up to meet that demand by creating the learning environments that families really want.
I know that there's been a huge shift around the pandemic and post-pandemic of people, first of all, really seeing what's happening in their kids' classrooms through Zoom school and starting to second guess whether or not that's the right educational option for their kids, but also having their kids at home and sort of having this stigma around, you can't have your kids at home. What a crazy idea, blown to pieces out of necessity, that sort of demystified homeschooling a little bit. Obviously, there's been huge cultural shifts around education because of that have made the time very ripe for the microschool movement and the school choice movement. But I'm really curious what you think some of the other factors are that are making now the time for this to catch on as opposed to a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And I'm particularly curious. Obviously, there are tons of digital education resources and academic resources that make it so much easier for a teacher to teach a classroom full of mixed age kids, and that also obviously empower the homeschooling movement. But I'm also curious about things like social media as an input. Like, how much do you think that has made a difference both in the proliferation of the idea of microschooling and homeschooling to make it a little less foreign and scary, but also allowing people to really tap into the network effects that are required to build a school, like this homeschool program that you just referenced, where there's 100 kids in a wait list. How much do you think social media powers people being able to find these types of programs in their community as opposed to trying to market it in the pre-internet age? Like, I'm really curious what you think some of the other things are in the present day world that are making all of these pieces come together for this proliferation of alternative education where, 10 years ago, the public school system was just as bad, but there wasn't this movement towards something else.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And just to, provide some context around this too, we know, for example, that homeschooling is gaining popularity. The Washington Post in fall of 2023 called it the fastest growing form of education in the U.S. Upwards of 6% of all K-12 U.S. students are homeschooled, which is sort of on par with the number of students who attend public charter schools in the U.S. So that's about 7%, about 9% of students attending a private school. So lots of growth in homeschooling. Private school enrollment is also on the rise, and public school enrollment is falling beyond what was sort of naturally expected due to declining birth rates in recent years. So we knew there was going to be a dip in public school enrollment, but that dip has been far deeper than what was predicted because so many families are, choosing options besides a traditional public school. So, yeah, I think to answer your question, I think there are really 3 top reasons that are driving this growing demand for individualized, innovative education. And then the first one and the main one that I just already alluded to, and you have as well, are these network effects that just keep building on each other. This movement began well before COVID, well before 2020, but the network effects, the real sort of impact of this movement is really being felt now as more parents see what's possible for their children's education. They recognize that homeschooling, for example, is quite doable, that it's not sort of this, in many cases, the stereotype of a parent, typically a mom, sitting around a kitchen table with her children and a textbook and packaged curriculum. That there's homeschooling is much more versatile. There's so many more ways to approach homeschooling, and there's so many of these microschools and pods and learning collaboratives that sort of foundationally are based on homeschooling, and that students might be legally recognized as homeschoolers, but they could be attending a microschool, for example, up to 5 days a week as a full-time schooling alternative for a fraction of the cost of a traditional private school. You see the growth of hybrid homeschool programs, which typically meet off-site 2 to 3 days a week with hired educators. Again, something that began back in the 1990s, but has seen skyrocketing popularity in recent years. So there's those network effects from the parent side, and then the network effects on the founder side of more of these entrepreneurial parents and teachers feeling that they have the confidence to be able to take on the challenge of running essentially a small business, running a school or a learning environment that serves the needs of their communities. There's incredible resources available to them now. I think of organizations like the National Microschooling Center or VELA, which is a national founder network and philanthropy that provides microgrants to founders who are creating these innovative spaces. And then I think about, sort of startup accelerator programs like KaiPod and the KaiPod Catalyst program, or Microschool Solutions, that help entrepreneurial parents and teachers who want to create a program to, feel like they have the tools and resources to make that happen, kind of walk them through step by step. Launch Your Kind is another example, run by Kind Academy founder Iman Aline in Florida, that really helps more of these microschools get off the ground. So the network effects really are probably the biggest piece of this. But another reason that we see this current growth in these models are the growth of school choice policies across the U.S. And again, this was something that was taking root prior to 2020. We saw increasing appetite for education funding to follow students instead of going directly to school systems, so that families would be able to decide how, where, what, and with whom their children could learn. And again, since 2020, we've seen explosive growth in school choice policies. We now are up to 15 states that have universal school choice, and we had none as of 2020. And then we, in total, have 33 states plus Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico that have some version of private school choice, in which, again, a portion of state-allocated education funding can go to students toward the educational setting that's right for them. And in many states, that setting can include microschools and homeschooling collaboratives and learning pods and virtual platforms and tutoring and educational therapies. Certainly the most expansive school choice policies take that expansive definition of education beyond schooling. So really enabling parents to unbundle education from schooling and decide exactly how they want to piece together an educational experience for their kids. So I think I often say that, this education entrepreneurship movement and interest in these learning models is happening everywhere, all across the U.S. It's happening in blue states and red states and purple states. It's happening in states with and without school choice policies. But it's definitely accelerating in states with robust school choice policies, especially states that have had sort of a long culture of choice in education, of parents really being in the driver's seat of their education. So I think about states like Arizona and Florida that for years have led the country in school choice policies. Those policies recently became universal, meaning that all K-12 students in the state are eligible for somewhere in the range of around $7,000 or $8,000 per student per year to use on educational expenses that are right for their kids. And because of that kind of culture of parental choice in education that those states and others have built up, we're seeing, rapid growth in these models. Very quickly, microschools filling to capacity and wait lists emerging, which is then a signal to other potential founders that there's unmet demand here, and we should, create our own program that enables more families to have just what they're looking for. And what they're looking for is really the third reason that I think we're seeing this current growth in these innovative individualized education models, and that is a real desire for personalization rather than this one size fits all approach to education. If we think about it, and you talk about this a lot too, Hannah, is we have so much individualization and personalization in every other part of our lives. And yet in education, it's been historically very stagnant and standardized. And so I think parents, and it's especially true since COVID, are just sort of fed up with that one size fits all standardized education model and are looking for something that's much more responsive to their individual needs, that's aligned with their personal preferences and values, and that really meets their children where they are, recognizing that we don't all learn the same things in the same way at the same time. And we don't have to in an age where we have the capacity to tap into these incredible curriculum tools that enable us very easily to differentiate learning and teaching, to meet a child where they're at and help them to develop skills in their own timetable and reach their full potential.
You mentioned Arizona and Florida as being some of the states that have a longer tradition of school choice, and
Yeah.
so it's maybe a little bit of an easier adoption curve for families to take on universal school choice and kind of intuitively know what to do with it because it's just existed in their states for longer. Are there other states where you're seeing particularly large amounts of entrepreneurship or particularly large amounts of adoption that have either surprised you or have excited you? What are other states that people should be watching?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is happening everywhere. I spent some time, for example, in Southern Oregon, a blue state, no private school choice programs, and none on the horizon anytime soon. And in this sort of rural area, about 4 hours south of Portland, Oregon, there's this booming hub of education entrepreneurship there. Again, of families realizing that the existing school system doesn't meet their needs. They want to do something different. They want something that's much more reflective of sort of 21st century realities, and that they don't feel like the current education system is offering that. And so they build these community based solutions and their own grassroots organizations to support these everyday founders. So there's an organization in Southern Oregon, sort of the Grants Pass, Oregon area, called Options for Education, that really helps to identify the new learning environments that are sprouting and connect parents to those environments, elevate the founders who are creating these programs. And so, this is really, it's happening all over, which is what's so exciting. What's really neat to see are in states, for example, like Utah, that passed universal school choice more recently. They and has about $8,000 per pupil in funding each year. There hadn't been a the robust culture of education choice, the way we saw, for example, in Florida and Arizona and Utah. But Utah has also, for a long time, had a large homeschooling population, and homeschooling, obviously, it's parents exercising education choice, choosing a private education approach, and just that acceptance and ubiquity of homeschooling and all of the different entrepreneurs who are serving the homeschooling community in a variety of ways by offering one-off classes or tutoring and so forth. Just that foundation has really inspired more and more founders to launch their own programs. And in fact, again, another founder who I recently interviewed on my podcast and wrote about, who just wrote an article about this for us at fee.org. Jenny Jones runs a home-based homeschooling microschool out of her home several days a week in Utah. And she specifically said that it was the new Utah Fits All scholarship, the universal school choice policy that Utah passed, that prompted her to do this because she wanted to make sure that access was possible for families to be able to attend her program. And she said it was that in combination with Utah's deregulatory efforts to make it easier for microschools to operate in all zones and in home-based settings without sort of a whole litany of regulations or requirements to be able to do that. It was that sort of rezoning deregulation process that occurred in Utah in conjunction with the growth of school choice policies in Utah that she credits with enabling her to launch her program. And so, yeah, it's just exciting to see the ways in which these policies can elevate or constrain education entrepreneurship.
Can you talk a little bit about that last point? Because I
Yeah.
think I hear about this a lot on X, and I'm sure you do too. Um, there's a lot of concern about school choice policies constraining people's freedom in the long run. And I'm curious if and what you see in practice, or what concerns you hear people talking about that you think are valid or are things that we should actually be watching.
Yeah, well, I think there's sort of two answers to that question. When you said talk about the second piece, regulation constraining education entrepreneurship, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then I can address the school choice piece in a moment. But we see the ways in which deregulation or states that make it easy for people to start private schools or make it easy to homeschool have high growth rates in terms of these new schools and spaces emerging. And then in states where it may not be so easy to start a private school or may not be so easy to homeschool or create these homeschooling collaboratives, there's slower rate of acceleration in those states. Again, happening everywhere, but where it's happening quickly and effectively and easily are states that have a sort of a low regulatory apparatus. I talk a lot about founders who run into some of these zoning problems, and I mentioned that Utah really tackled that with its microschool bill that passed last year and had immediate impacts for microschool founders. For example, I had another founder on my podcast who said she had been running her microschool, I think for 2 or 3 years previously, no issues. And then she got a notice that she had to halt her operations because she wasn't zoned properly for a school, essentially, even though she's a microschool that looks nothing like a traditional school. And she was told to cease operations, even though she had been successfully working there for a long time, had families who were thrilled with all of her work. But fortunately, the Utah zoning bill had passed just around the time that this order was coming down, and that took care of it. It sort of trumped that effort to shut her down because she was able to operate. Very easily. Well, in states that don't have that kind of acknowledgement of the difference between today's innovative schools and spaces and traditional schools and spaces, many founders have a hard time finding locations that are zoned properly for what they want to do. It can often be very expensive for them to find a location because they have to, in some cases, undertake these elaborate parking analyses or, install industrial sprinkler systems meant for, enormous public school buildings for their, 900 square foot microschool. So there's those kinds of regulatory barriers, and there's a lot of effort underway to acknowledge some of these regulatory barriers and remove them for these innovative spaces that, again, shouldn't be held to sort of the same regulatory standards that a 2,000 person traditional school would be held to. So that's sort of the constraints on entrepreneurship from the regulatory side. Now, I think the other question that you probe is or that you posited is also really important that we really should talk about, and that is there's justifiable fears, particularly among homeschooling families, that the growth of school choice policies that enable education funding to follow families, including in some areas, homeschooling families, if they choose, could lead to greater regulation. I think that's what you were sort of getting at, right? But thankfully, the data doesn't back this up. I'll point your listeners and viewers to a wonderful new paper that was published recently by Angela Watson at Johns Hopkins University. She's a researcher there who launched the Homeschool Hub at Johns Hopkins University that helps to sort of identify trends and available data in homeschooling nationwide. She published this recent paper with Jeremy Newman of the Texas Homeschool Coalition that looks at the growth of school choice policies and other kind of access programs for homeschoolers, like enabling homeschoolers, for example, in some states to participate in various public school courses or sports or activities if they wanted to really look at what is the connection, if any, between these school choice policies and access programs and potential regulation of homeschooling. And they find that there is no correlation. And in fact, homeschooling regulation, they say, has decreased rather than increased over time. And there's other data that backs that up as well. I think it's important for folks to realize that the states often that have the most regulation of homeschooling are states that have no private school choice programs and may not have access programs for homeschooling. I mean, I take my state, for example, of Massachusetts, where I've homeschooled for over a decade. Massachusetts is considered one of the top five highest regulation states for homeschooling, according to HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. We have no private school choice, and it's very difficult for students to participate in public school activities, sort of on an ad hoc basis at the discretion of each individual school district. And again, we have one of the highest states in terms of regulation of homeschooling, and yet you look at states like Florida and Utah and Arizona, where it's much easier to homeschool. And they have robust school choice programs, including many that homeschooling families are taking advantage of. Just another, not to belabor the point, Hannah, but just another sort of recent case in point of this is that at the end of February, Wyoming deregulated homeschooling even further in that state. So now Wyoming becomes the 12th state to have little or no regulation. There's no more reporting requirements. You don't have to let the state know that you're homeschooling and report to them. And they have, really a tremendous amount of freedom. So now they join the states for the least amount of regulation. And a week after Wyoming passed this deregulation of homeschooling bill, it passed a universal school choice policy that enables education funding to follow students. And so I think that there's certainly, we always need to be vigilant about the potential for regulation of homeschooling, of private education in general, of parental rights, and so forth. But the reality is that states that have passed school choice policies tend to have more respect, I think, for parental choice in education, which carries over to homeschooling families. And the states where homeschooling is most restrictive and also can be very difficult to start private schools, so private education generally is more restrictive, tend to be states that don't have private school choice programs. We have to be on the lookout for regulation, but the reality is that we shouldn't fear it. And in fact, homeschoolers and others who care about educational freedom should welcome school choice because it leads to a culture in these states of expecting parental choice in education, of shifting control of education from the state to the family, which serves families, learners, educators really well.
What is your level of optimism about school choice becoming the norm in every state in the country or the majority of states in the country? Like, what are you seeing in terms of the push towards school choice beyond the 13 states where it's currently in effect, and especially in some of these states that historically are much less friendly to homeschoolers, and it's much harder, there's much more regulation around private schooling? Do you think that there's enough momentum that eventually this could become a nationwide norm?
Yeah. So again, right now we have 33 states plus DC and Puerto Rico that have some version of private school choice, 15 states now with Wyoming universal eligibility for all K to 12 students. I don't know, Hannah. I don't foresee anytime soon a state like mine, like Massachusetts, moving in this direction. I hope that within the next decade there's some movement there, and that in sort of these states that have zero private school choice, there's at least some effort to move towards, tax credit scholarship programs that enable low-income families to exit an assigned district school for a private school of their choice. Um, but I don't know. I think we'll definitely see an expansion beyond these states, these existing states, to more states. We'll definitely see an expansion to universal programs in the states that don't yet have them. But in terms of penetrating the kind of strongholds of opposition to school choice, I don't know. What I will say though is that even again in states like mine, there is still a groundswell of interest in education entrepreneurship. So there are still these learning centers and microschools and low-cost private schools and hybrid homeschool programs that are being started and that are rapidly growing, um, even in states that don't have robust school choice policies. I talked about in a recent 74 article that I wrote about the rise of church-based learning centers across the country, and specifically in Massachusetts. There's one church-based learning center connected to the largest Hispanic church in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is a large city in the center of the state, that has roughly 100 students right now, and they just got started a couple of years ago. There's huge parent demand in that community for something different. A similar story with hybrid homeschools. Again, these programs where you go send your children to an off-site location a couple of days a week to have a sort of established curriculum, and then you work on that curriculum with your kids at home on the remaining days. That, again, those programs really seeing a lot of growth over the past few years, again, even in a state like mine that doesn't have school choice. So there's so much to be optimistic about, not only in the choice area, but also, and I think arguably more so, in entrepreneurship in general.
What are the states that people should be watching where you think there's the highest probability of universal school choice coming into effect? Obviously, there's been rumblings in Texas for years about this. What are some of the other states that are on your radar where you think sooner rather than later this may come into effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of them have already happened for this legislative session this year, Wyoming and Tennessee being two among them. It'll be great to see what happens in Texas. Texas would be a game changer. It would be the largest initial launch of a universal school choice program if it passes in the country's history. There would be, so many students that would be initially eligible, and then if it rises to, again, full universal eligibility, it would be a game changer just in terms of the population of students eligible for something else. But again, Texas is another place, certainly in the Austin area, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area I've visited. Lots of innovation happening there in education, of parents and teachers building what they can't find, reimagining what education can be, and making it much more personalized. And again, it's like I'm a broken record, but many of these programs, very quickly fill to capacity. There's so much unmet demand here that it's a great time to be an entrepreneur.
You referenced a couple of times the growing trend continuing through, sort of the post-pandemic shifts in the education landscape of this rise of the microschool movement. I want to drill into this a little bit more because I know that different types of programs have seen very different lines in growth around the pandemic and post-pandemic. There were a lot of um, programs that had huge spikes during the peak of the pandemic and then kind of some drop off after schools reopened and families were sending their kids back to public school again. Um, and so I think different types of programs have experienced different growth curves, and not all of them have been linear up and to the right through the pandemic and beyond. But it sounds like, in general, the trend that you're seeing is very much sustained growth post-COVID. But I want to dig into this a little bit more because I'm curious, like, do the things that you're seeing also reflect a big spike during the peak of the pandemic and then sort of a tapering off of the acceleration of growth? Was there a dip that a lot of people were experiencing post-pandemic that's picking up again with the rise of school choice? Like, are you seeing the majority of things like actually picking up momentum like a couple years out from the pandemic and weren't really affected directly at all by families who public schools were closed and were looking for another option? Like, what are the biggest things that you're seeing here?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this because it really is so exciting. I think there's really two answers, and I'll start with the first, which is um, again, I'll go back to the research out of Johns Hopkins University and Angela Watson's Homeschool Hub, which is really, I feel like, the first organization that's able to compile, a variety of different existing databases of information on homeschooling, going back decades, from when homeschooling in certain states began to be tracked, and you sort of see that longitudinal data in really meaningful ways. And so they released a report that found they released this report last fall that found that in the vast majority of states that report homeschooling data, and not every state does. Again, those low regulation states, in many cases, don't report data because they don't collect data.
We love them
from
for
homeschooling
everything
families.
but like numbers purposes.
Well, I mean, I love the fact that homeschooling is totally deregulated. But yes, in terms of identifying trends, it can be a little bit difficult. But the states that do, the vast majority of them, according to Census Bureau data and Department of Education data available in these states, the vast majority of them found that homeschooling rates increased in the fall of 2023 compared to the fall of 2022. So this is well after COVID and school shutdowns. Now, in most places, homeschooling isn't at that 2020 peak rate where, we saw something like a doubling of the homeschool population in that initial pandemic year. But almost everywhere, homeschooling remains above pre-pandemic levels, so above kind of 2019 levels. And in the majority of states that were analyzed in this Johns Hopkins data, they were seeing an increase in 23 compared to 2022. So what's going on there? Well, Professor Watson says we don't really know. Of course, we have to dig into a little bit more about this. But clearly, it's not directly related to the pandemic. I would suggest that, again, it's these network effects. It's parents recognizing there's other ways of approaching education, realizing that private education, or private schools in particular, today's private schools are nothing like traditional private schools. For one thing, they're extremely low cost. For another thing, they're highly personalized. They really don't look anything like conventional education. So that's appealing to parents. And then again, these founders realizing parent demand, going off and meeting that demand by opening new schools and spaces, which gets me to sort of my second point, which is that I think a strength of the microschooling movement and this innovative education movement more generally is the fact that it's much more market-based, choice-enabled, and entrepreneur-driven. So we're really starting to see the emergence of a decentralized free market in education that we see in so many other areas of our lives where we have choice, variety, and abundance. Just look at the restaurants and coffee shops that are available to us. We have an assortment of different options, and we just haven't had that assortment in education up until now. Now, with that, with sort of a robust, dynamic dynamic free market in education, we're going to see a lot of dynamism. We're going to see successful programs grow and flourish, maybe acquire other programs. And we're also going to see programs that are not meeting parent demand shut down. And that is a good thing. I believe, just like it's a good thing when restaurants that are not pleasing their customers and are not meeting customer demand shut down, because that frees up resources for other more in-demand enterprises to take up that space. And so, I think that we need to welcome that dynamism, and that and appreciate that there will be a little bit of that churn, and that's okay. And I think, some people say, well, but it's education. Do we really, can we really tolerate closing of schools? Well, just look at public schools in many places, especially again in choice heavy states. Look at South Florida, where there's a robust hub of education, entrepreneurship, and innovation fueled by universal school choice. Public schools there are shutting down due to low enrollment. And so there's no guarantee that a public school is going to be around, right? So I don't think we should worry about these microschools or private schools potentially shutting down. I think that this is where, and I talk about this in my new book too, there's things that parents can do to sort of figure out the health of a potential microschool they may be considering. There's, again, certainly those network effects. How do you know that the restaurant you're going to is high quality? Well, you go to Yelp, right? Or you talk to friends. And I think that same dynamic is beginning to happen in education, which is, really welcomed. And I'll just say one final thing that I think is really important to note is that I find that when microschools do shut down for a variety of reasons, it's not always because of lack of customer demand, just like, other enterprises don't always shut down due to lack of demand. But to the extent that they do shut down, I find that they shut down really responsibly, that the founders really go above and beyond to try to place their students in another microschool in a different place. They may escort them to interviews at a different microschool or school tours somewhere else, or really help them make that transition as smoothly as possible.
What are your thoughts on larger networks of small schools emerging versus the very hyper local? There's one school founder and operator who knows every single student, and there's no energy being put towards scaling. Like, the entire locus of the school is within the community. Do you foresee there being a large rise in networks of micro schools and like larger programs that are attempting to scale either across a state or even across the country? Or do you feel like most of the momentum you see is in the smaller hyper local schools? I'm curious about this both from the perspective of the school founders that you're talking to. Like, is there sort of a trend towards scaling and growth and trying to build larger programs, or is most of the interest very local? But also from the perspective of the families that you talk to, do you feel like there's a significantly larger market demand for the hyper local, or do you think that if larger networked schools were to arise, that like the family demand is there? And part of the reason I ask is because network schools seem to be very hard to build. No one's really cracked the code yet in the alternative education space. Like, there aren't huge, robust networks of schools that are like really settled into a sustainable model. It's something that people are still trying to figure out how to do at scale. But I'm also curious, like, so much of the appeal sometimes is the fact that you're sending your kids somewhere where the person who's building the school and running everything knows your child personally and is developing the program around the needs of their very local community and their very local customer base. And so I'm curious to sort of like what the sentiments are that you're picking up. And maybe it's too early to know. Maybe we need more years of people establishing themselves in small communities and then starting to think about scale to really have a sense of trends. But I'm just curious, like, what the general sentiment is that you're picking up and what you feel the trends might be that will develop with us.
Yeah, I think it's both, Hannah, right? I mean, I think, again, this is what's so exciting about the emergence of this decentralized entrepreneur-based marketplace of education options that families are really able to pick and choose from a variety of options in education so that they can find just the right thing for them. And it could be different things for different kids within their own family, even at different times, right? So we have that ability to really satisfy our own distinct needs and preferences now in education that we just haven't had before. That's why it's so exciting. And some of that um, meeting that demand is going to come from sort of boutique, one-off, hyper-local enterprises. And in other cases, it will be these larger national networks. And it's similar to, again, what we see in other parts of our lives. Sometimes I go to the, boutique coffee shop in my city. There's only one of them in the area, right? It's just a mom and pop shop. And sometimes I'll go to Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts, right? So I think we're going to see both. And I think that that's really exciting because we're going to be able to satisfy our needs and wants in a whole variety of ways that are meaningful to us. Now, I think that we're seeing growth in both of those things. We're seeing growth in the introduction of these one-off programs, and many of the founders I talk to have no desire to expand. They're happy to run their one school or space. Others are saying, I'm going to open new schools, right? Many of them these microschools who want to scale, want to do so laterally, not vertically. They don't necessarily want to move from 50 kids to 250 kids because they value that small, personalized learning model. So they'll scale laterally by opening a second location, and maybe, moving to a different city or even a different county or a different state. They'll move that way. Many of them are moving to states that have these robust school choice policies that apply to microschools and similar models so that they can meet the demand for families there. But then you also see these networks. And I think of some of the early networks that I'm so thrilled have gained increased popularity over the past 5 years. I think about Acton Academy, of course, created in Austin back in 2009 as one school, now roughly 300 of these learner-driven schools around the world, in many parts of the U.S. I think about Prenda, which was one of the first sort of home-based microschool models to emerge back in 2018 out of Arizona. And now Prenda is growing, spreading not only in Arizona, but in other places as well, and helping other founders to create Prenda microschools in their own homes. So, I think it's a both and. We're seeing this variety, this diversity of education options in much the same way we see variety and diversity in other parts of our lives.
I'm really curious if there are highlights that you have observed in your interviews and your travels around the country of micro schools that are hyper local, not just in their leadership and their customer base, but also in their curriculum and their academic approach. Like, have you seen micro schools that are particularly well adapted to the needs of a specific community in terms of what they're teaching and sort of how their curriculum and offerings are structured?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that, again, there's a sort of a combination. So many of these founders of these new programs are former public school teachers. So they have an ease with curriculum and are not intimidated by all the different curriculum options available to them. And so what they'll do is can pick and choose among a whole host of curriculum providers. Sometimes this is where it can be helpful to connect with organizations like the National Microschooling Center, where, founders might be able to access some of these curriculums for a lower cost. Because again, one of the benefits of traditional public or private schools is it's very expensive in some cases to purchase curriculum, and they won't sell to a small school with 12 kids, but through intermediaries like, for example, the National Microschooling Center, they're able to get access at a lower cost to some of these curriculum options. There's a lot of free curriculum options that are used not only by microschools, but traditional schools too. Of course, I think about Khan Academy, the free online platform that has a variety of resources and all kinds of subjects for students and teachers. I think about Duolingo for foreign language and so many others, and other low-cost curriculum. And then I think one of the things that we find, or that I find in talking to these founders, is that they are not wedded to one particular curriculum. It's not like we have a fourth grade curriculum for language arts. I have a bunch of kids who are at this reading level, and I will figure out what I need for them. And oh, by the way, this child learns in this way or is really receptive to this kind of teaching approach and curriculum approach. So this curriculum works really well for them, and another child really responds well to this other curriculum, and that's okay. So we have multiple curricula for different students based on their needs and preferences at that time. That's what's so exciting. And then you sort of layer on top of that the different educational philosophies and sort of values and viewpoints of the founders and families in those learning environments. So you might have schools that are faith-based that will incorporate, for example, biblical teachings and some biblical curriculum into their work. You'll have some schools that are focused on social justice activism, and so they'll incorporate that type of curriculum into their programs. You'll have, forest school types of programs where much of the day is outside, stomping in the mud, and that's very much a part of that school's identity and curriculum. And that's what's so amazing about this movement is that, again, it reflects the diversity of the human experience and all of our different needs, preferences, and values. And so that we're really able to find something that suits our needs and our children's needs in a variety of ways.
What is the percentage, and I asked this roughly, you may know the exact number, I'm guessing you don't, but like roughly the breakdown between micro schools that you see that are focused on K through 8 or maybe K through 6 versus programs that are tackling middle and high school?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of the newer models, we're still heavily focused on that K-8 space, and to some extent, the older models would be that way too. I mean, I think it's just that the nature of this movement and where the growth is, it's coming from new founders, people who are solving a problem in their community, and typically that problem would start in sort of the elementary school ages. Now, what I'm finding though is that I talk to founders who said, I was only going to do a K-5 school, or I was only going to do a K-8 school. And now I have parents saying, no, like we're not ready to leave for middle school or high school. And so again, like true entrepreneurs, they're responding to their community's needs and wants and expanding that way. They're adding in a middle school program or a high school program. I talked to a founder of a middle school in New Hampshire, the Harkness House. And again, the founder, former longtime public school teacher who opened a middle school microschool in the wake of COVID because he realized that the personalized learning was the way to go. And there was a lot of demand for this, and had family, and he had only ever intended to have his program be a microschool. It's a state recognized private school for middle school. But he had so many families said, what are we going to do from here? We don't want to go now to a traditional school after sampling this microschool environment. What can you do? And so he was very creative in collaborating with local community colleges to enable high schoolers to access dual enrollment classes, and then have a connection between the community college and the microschool with some transportation options, and having sort of the hub of the social environment and the peer and adult advising environment be at the microschool, but have that high school content, or actually college content, that dual enrollment piece, coming through the community college. And so I'm finding all these creative ways that founders are meeting this demand, are expanding into the high school years in particular. I think we're just going to see more and more of that too as these programs mature.
Last week, I had a guy named Nicholas Ellis on the podcast who runs a program called Christian Halls, which is a post-secondary education program. So the way it's structured, they partner with universities that have degree programs, but then they build local schools in smaller communities where college age kids can get their college degrees by using these licensed degree programs from these bigger universities. But then they're working in their communities, like apprenticing with people in the community who are working in the fields that they want to get into, or like, being set up with mentorship opportunities. And the goal of the program is to bridge the gap between the needs of young people, but making them accessible in smaller communities so that to kind of address the brain drain problem of students leaving their smaller communities because all of the resources and options exist in a big city, and then they go get their career started in the big city and they may never come back, or if they do, it's much later in their careers when they finally make it back to their hometown. And so it's sort of like a micro school model for college, which is a little bit of a stretch. I don't think that's how he would describe it, but it feels like there's a lot of similarities, and their program's very, very bullish on the micro school movement because they see a lot of opportunity to partner with
Mm.
micro schools and like families who want to go through micro schools and move into, more localized higher education options where their kids can take advantage of the opportunities that exist in their small town, but without saying no to all of the opportunities that exist elsewhere. And talking to him made me wonder how you think about micro schools and their role in smaller communities. Like, do you think that there's a difference between a smaller community sending all of its kids to public school and sort of the long-term outcomes for that community versus the possibilities that start to emerge when your kids are educated more locally? Like, do you think that micro schools have an effect on smaller communities besides just the logistical differences of how many kids are enrolled in the public school and where parents are driving their kids to school every day?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll answer it in two ways. I guess the first part is I would just respond to your comment about these apprenticeship programs and sort of micro credentialing programs that I think are so exciting. I think that there's increasingly an acknowledgement of different pathways to adulthood. And sometimes that could include college, sometimes that could include career, maybe a combination of both, and so forth. And I'll just say that I think one of the things that attracts many families to these alternatives to traditional schooling is getting off of that conveyor belt that they feel like they might be on in the traditional system. That's okay, you go through K to 12 schooling, checking the boxes, doing what you're told, and then you'll go to college, and then you'll get this job. And they just feel like it's so they're like automatons kind of going through this movement or this process that might not be working well for their kids. Maybe their kids aren't happy. Maybe their kids are dealing with stress and overload from the pressure cooker of traditional schooling in many places, and they want something different. And so that's what's attracting them to these alternatives. But in terms of your actual question about smaller communities and how this movement's helping them, I think that's again where school choice policies can really make a big difference. And I think about a school in rural Utah, the Orchard STEM School, that's an outdoor-based, STEM-focused microschool that opened again because of the new Utah Fits All Education Scholarship Program, the Universal ESA, that as the founder told me, and he's profiled in my Joyful Learning book, he says that this was really, it was the school choice policies that really enable this kind of innovative education model to come to rural communities like his, because now families have access. And so previously there were very limited choices for education available to families. And for the most part, it was the traditional public school. And now families have more and more options. So I think this is, again, where we're seeing entrepreneurship and innovation in education in big cities and small towns, rural areas, and suburban areas. We're seeing it, again, in red states and blue states, school choice heavy states and those without it. But it's really addressing community needs in a whole variety of ways.
If people want to learn more about your forthcoming book, or if they want to dig into more of your work in general, where would you send them next after this conversation?
Well, I'd love to connect with them on X at Kerry_edu. You can pre-order my book, Joyful Learning, wherever you get your books. It'll be on bookstore shelves in August of this year. You could go to joyfullearningbook.com if you want to find a variety of ways to buy the book there. And you can also find me at the Foundation for Economic Education at fee.org/Kerry.
Amazing. Kerry, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. As always, this was such a pleasure.
Always great to be with you, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll talk more soon.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.